A woman in a white dress thinks she understands radar? Sit still. Laughter rippled through the seats as interference warning lights flickered overhead. Elena flipped through her leather notebook, filled with aviation symbols and calculations. Minutes later, engines sputtered. Radio went silent. The plane drifted toward restricted airspace. She stood up, grabbed the backup microphone. "This is Viper." On station. The sky fell dead silent. F-22s immediately broke radio silence. "Viper, return." Elena Cross, 30 years old, walked down the aircraft aisle wearing a crisp white business dress that hugged her slender frame with professional elegance. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a worn leather notebook that looked like it had seen years of careful use. She settled into window seat 17A on the commercial flight from Denver to Seattle, immediately opening her notebook and beginning to write. Her eyes moved constantly between the small window and her pages, recording observations in neat handwriting that covered line after line with technical symbols and calculations. The middle-aged businessman in seat 17B glanced over at her work with casual curiosity. When he saw the contents of her notebook, wind vectors, altitude calculations, aviation navigation codes, he couldn't suppress a condescending smirk. "What is this stuff?" he asked loudly, making sure other passengers could hear his amusement. "Are you playing pilot or something?" Elena looked up briefly and spoke in a quiet, professional voice. "Aviation notation, wind patterns, and navigation references." The man burst into laughter, deliberately projecting his voice so the surrounding rows could join in his entertainment. "A secretary in a white dress thinks she's an aviator." What's next? Top Gun, PowerPoint edition. Several passengers in nearby seats chuckled along, finding humor in the idea of someone who looked like a corporate administrator pretending to understand flight operations. A woman behind them whispered to her husband, just loud enough for Elena to hear, "She looks like middle management going to some boring conference." Probably got those symbols from a Google search. Elena pressed her lips together but said nothing in response. She simply turned to a fresh page in her notebook and continued writing, her pen moving steadily across the paper with practiced precision. When a small girl in the row ahead dropped her stuffed airplane, Elena quickly bent down to retrieve it. As she handed it back, she smiled warmly and said, "Make sure to buckle the seat belt for your airplane, sweetie. Safety first." An elderly woman sitting across the aisle watched this interaction with interest. "You have very steady hands, dear," she observed. "Not like most young office workers I meet. There's something different about the way you move." When the flight attendant made the standard announcement asking if anyone had medical training, Elena stood up politely and said, "I've had emergency response training." The businessman in 17B couldn't resist another opportunity for mockery. "What kind of training? Conference room first aid?" His comment triggered another wave of chuckles from passengers, who assumed Elena was just another corporate employee trying to feel important. Elena returned to her seat without defending herself, but there was a flash of determination in her eyes that the elderly woman noticed and remembered. As the flight continued, Elena kept writing in her notebook, occasionally glancing out the window with an intensity that seemed unusual for casual air travel. She appeared to be reading the sky itself, tracking cloud formations and atmospheric conditions with the focused attention of someone who understood aviation weather systems. The businessman continued his commentary throughout the first hour of flight, entertaining his fellow passengers with observations about office girls who think they understand flying and secretaries with delusions of being pilots. Elena absorbed every insult in silence, her pen never stopping its movement across the pages of calculations and technical notations that would have impressed any flight instructor if they had bothered to look carefully. But no one bothered to look carefully. They saw only a professional woman in business attire, someone to be dismissed and mocked rather than taken seriously. The elderly woman, Mrs. Chen, later told reporters, they laughed at her, made jokes about her white dress getting wrinkled when she bent over. But her eyes, they were bright, like someone who already owned the sky. I could tell there was something special about her that nobody else was seeing. A loud metallic bang echoed from the left wing, followed by violent shaking that threw passengers against their seatbelts. Thin smoke began seeping into the cabin through the air vents, creating an acrid smell that made people cough and look around nervously. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, strained and uncertain. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm while we assess the situation. But minutes passed with no further announcements, and the aircraft began an uncontrolled drift to the left, taking it dangerously close to restricted military airspace. Warning lights on the instrument panel were flashing, and the flight crew's increasingly frantic radio transmissions revealed the severity of their situation. The first officer's panicked voice came through the cockpit door. "We've lost primary communications. Ground control isn't responding. We're heading into prohibited airspace and can't establish contact." Flight attendants moved through the cabin with forced smiles that didn't hide their growing concern. Passengers began to understand that this was more than routine turbulence. They were facing a genuine emergency with potentially deadly consequences. The businessman in seat 17B, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine fear, turned to Elena with desperate sarcasm. "Hey there, Top Gun PowerPoint. Maybe now you can pull out that little notebook and save us all." His nervous laughter was echoed by several other passengers who were looking for any way to release their anxiety. Elena calmly closed her notebook, smoothed her white dress, and stood up. She walked deliberately toward the rear galley, her movements steady despite the aircraft's erratic motion. A flight attendant immediately moved to intercept her. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat. You're not authorized to access emergency equipment. This is military frequency radio. Civilians can't use it." Elena ignored the protest and knelt beside the rear communications panel, quickly removing the access cover to reveal backup radio wiring and controls that most passengers didn't even know existed. Her movements were precise and confident, like someone who had performed these actions many times before. Passengers craned their necks to watch, whispering questions to each other. What is she doing? Is she crazy? Does she actually think she can fix this? Elena connected the backup microphone system, adjusted frequency settings with practiced efficiency, and keyed the transmit button. When she spoke, her voice carried a calm authority that cut through the cabin noise and panic. "This is Viper. On station. Request guard relay and corridor assistance." The response came immediately, crackling through speakers throughout the aircraft. "Viper. Copy. NORAD standing by." An F-22 fighter pilot's voice joined the frequency, his tone filled with disbelief. "Say again your call sign, Viper?" The entire cabin fell completely silent. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every crew member stopped what they were doing and stared at the woman in the white dress who had just opened a direct communication channel with the United States Air Force. Elena's voice remained steady and professional as she issued precise instructions. Request immediate corridor transfer to civilian airway Sierra 2. Adjust vector west by 3 degrees. Maintain flight level 18,000. The first officer in the cockpit heard these commands through the intercom system and looked at his instruments in amazement. The directions were exactly what they needed to avoid the restricted military zone and establish a safe approach to the nearest suitable airport. "Who is giving those instructions?" he asked the flight attendants through the cabin communication system. "Those are perfect navigation corrections." Elena continued coordinating with military air traffic control, her notebook now open as she calculated wind correction factors and optimal flight paths. Her white dress was beginning to show stains from smoke and hydraulic fluid, but her concentration never wavered. The businessman in 17B sat frozen in his seat, his face pale with the realization that he had been mocking someone whose expertise far exceeded anything he had imagined possible. 2 F-22 Raptor fighters appeared alongside the commercial aircraft, taking protective escort positions while Elena coordinated the emergency approach. The fighter pilots communicated with her as if she were their commanding officer, following her tactical instructions without question. "Viper, we have visual contact with your aircraft," one F-22 pilot reported. "We're maintaining escort formation per your instructions." Elena acknowledged with professional brevity. "Copy escort. Maintain current separation. Civilian aircraft has priority in designated corridor." NORAD command broke radio silence across the entire region, making an unprecedented announcement. "All stations hold current positions. Viper has operational control of emergency corridor Sierra Viper White." The name Viper carried weight in military aviation circles that civilian passengers couldn't understand, but the tone of respect in every military voice made it clear that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The senior flight attendant, Maria Santos, later testified, "Her white dress was getting stained with smoke and hydraulic fluid, and her hands had a slight tremor, but her voice was like steel. When she spoke, the entire sky seemed to listen. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of flying." Word spread through military aviation networks like lightning striking a communications tower. The legendary call sign Viper, a pilot who had disappeared from all official records 7 years earlier, was actively coordinating emergency air traffic from a civilian aircraft. Viper wasn't just any call sign in United States Air Force history. It belonged to Elena Cross, a tactical communications specialist and emergency flight coordinator who had saved dozens of military aircraft and their crews during her classified career. She had been the invisible voice that guided lost pilots home, coordinated impossible rescue missions, and maintained air traffic control when conventional systems failed. Elena stood in the rear galley of the commercial aircraft, her white business dress now marked with smoke stains and hydraulic fluid, calmly directing F-22 fighter jets and coordinating with NORAD command as if she were still sitting in a military control tower. The damaged airliner was losing altitude and experiencing multiple system failures, but Elena's voice never showed stress or uncertainty. She calculated wind vectors in her head, adjusted for atmospheric pressure variations, and provided flight path corrections that kept the aircraft away from populated areas and military installations. "Flight level 16,000 and descending," she radioed to the F-22 escort. "Request runway preparation at McCord. We'll need full emergency response and medical standby." The fighter pilots responded with the crisp professionalism of military personnel addressing a superior officer. "Copy, Viper. McCord Tower is clearing all traffic. Emergency crews are standing by." Inside the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The same people who had mocked Elena's notebook and dismissed her as just another office worker now watched her with awe and growing understanding of how badly they had misjudged her capabilities. The businessman in seat 17B, who had led the mockery with his cruel jokes about PowerPoint pilots and secretaries playing aviation, sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by shame and the realization that his life was being saved by someone he had treated with such disrespect. Elena continued working, splitting her attention between radio communications and the calculations in her leather notebook. She tracked multiple aircraft positions, coordinated with civilian air traffic control, and managed the complex logistics of emergency landing procedures while maintaining calm communication with increasingly panicked passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced over the aircraft's public address system, "we're going to experience a rough landing, but everything is under control. Please ensure your seatbelts are tight and your seats are in the upright position." Her voice carried the same calm authority that had guided military pilots through combat situations and emergency evacuations. Children stopped crying when they heard her speak. Anxious adults found themselves breathing easier despite the continuing emergency. The F-22 escort pilots maintained perfect formation alongside the airliner as Elena guided them through a storm system that would have been impossible to navigate without her expertise in atmospheric conditions and tactical flight operations. "Viper, this is Raptor 1, radioed the lead fighter pilot. "Weather radar shows severe turbulence ahead. Recommend altitude adjustment." Elena consulted her notebook calculations and responded immediately. "Negative, Raptor 1. Maintain current altitude. Turbulence pocket extends from 1 to 4,000 to 1 to 8,000. We're threading the needle at 1.6. The fighter pilot followed her instructions without question, and the commercial aircraft passed through the weather system with minimal buffeting, exactly as Elena had predicted. Radio communications crackled with increasing activity as more military aircraft joined the coordination effort. Elena managed multiple frequencies simultaneously, her expertise allowing her to track dozens of aircraft positions while maintaining primary responsibility for the emergency landing. "McCord Tower, this is Viper," she transmitted as the runway came into sight. "We're on final approach, single engine, hydraulic failure, full emergency landing. Clear all traffic and maintain emergency protocols." The tower response came immediately. "Viper, you have priority clearance. Emergency crews are standing by. Welcome back to active status." The landing was violent but controlled. Elena's precise calculations had positioned the aircraft perfectly for touchdown, despite the mechanical failures and adverse weather conditions. The plane bounced twice, skidded sideways as the damaged landing gear struggled to maintain traction, and finally came to rest just past the midpoint of the runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately, but remarkably, every passenger and crew member was alive and conscious. What should have been a catastrophic crash had become a successful emergency landing through Elena's expert coordination and tactical knowledge. As passengers began evacuating through emergency slides, Elena remained at her position in the rear galley, ensuring that all communications were properly transferred back to conventional air traffic control. She was the last person to leave the aircraft, just as she had been trained to do during her military career. The businessman from seat 17B waited for her at the bottom of the emergency slide. When Elena reached the ground, he dropped to his knees on the airport tarmac, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion and shame. "We judged you. We mocked you. We treated you like you didn't matter. And you saved every one of us, anyway." Elena looked down at him, her white dress torn and stained, her hair disheveled from the emergency, but her eyes still holding the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the crisis. "Don't ever underestimate people who choose to stay quiet," she said simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. They might be the ones who can make the entire sky listen when it matters most. NORAD Command made one final transmission that was heard by military personnel throughout the region. "Viper, "You're never forgotten." The words carried decades of respect and recognition for a pilot whose classified service had saved countless lives, but could never be publicly acknowledged until this moment. Elena walked away from the aircraft, and the gathering crowd of reporters and emergency personnel, disappearing into the controlled chaos of the emergency response, just as she had appeared, quietly, competently, and without seeking recognition for extraordinary service. Elena walked away from McCord Air Force Base that evening without speaking to the dozens of reporters who had gathered at the scene. She declined interviews, refused to appear on camera, and ignored requests for statements about her extraordinary coordination of the emergency landing. But the story exploded across social media and news networks within hours. Woman in white dress forces, NORAD to break radio silence, became headline news on every major network. Aviation experts struggled to explain how someone with no apparent official credentials had commanded military air traffic control and coordinated F-22 fighter escorts. Military veterans began sharing fragments of stories about a legendary communications specialist known only as Viper, who had saved their units during classified missions that couldn't be discussed publicly even decades later. They spoke in careful, vague terms about impossible rescue coordinations and emergency air traffic management that had brought them home alive. The passengers of the emergency flight formed a support group they called Passengers of Viper, meeting regularly to share their memories of the day and process the psychological impact of their near-death experience. They established a scholarship fund for young women pursuing careers in aviation and emergency communications. The businessman from Seat 17B, whose name was revealed as Robert Chen, posted a public video apology that went viral across social media platforms. In the 3-minute confession, he broke down in tears as he acknowledged how his assumptions about gender, appearance, and professional capability had nearly prevented him from recognizing someone who would save his life. "I made jokes about her white dress, laughed at her notebook, dismissed her as just another office worker," he said through his tears. "I couldn't have been more wrong about another human being." Elena Cross is a hero, and I was too blind and prejudiced to see it. Elena never responded directly to his apology, but the video sparked national conversations about unconscious bias, professional stereotyping, and the dangerous assumptions people make based on appearance rather than capability. Flight attendants and airline personnel began receiving enhanced training in recognizing hidden expertise among passengers during emergency situations. Elena's story became a mandatory case study in aviation safety courses, teaching crews to look beyond appearances when seeking assistance during crises. A civilian emergency communications training program was established in Elena's honor, teaching basic crisis management and coordination skills to people who might find themselves in situations where conventional authority structures had broken down. The elderly woman who had recognized something special in Elena's demeanor became a frequent speaker at these training sessions. "The sky doesn't care what you're wearing," Mrs. Chen would tell her audiences. "It only listens to people who know how to speak its language." At McCord Air Force Base, a steel plaque was installed near the main runway with a simple inscription: "If you must ask who Viper is, you're not ready for the answer." The leather notebook that Elena had carried on the flight, filled with her aviation calculations and tactical notes, was eventually donated to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum as an example of how expertise and preparedness can emerge from the most unexpected sources. Young women entering aviation careers began carrying similar notebooks, inspired by Elena's example of quiet competence and professional readiness. Flight schools started teaching students that true expertise doesn't announce itself with uniforms or credentials. It reveals itself through knowledge, skill, and the courage to act when lives are at stake. Comment Viper stands. If you believe there are silent heroes living among us, waiting for the moment when their skills might save lives. Elena returned to her quiet civilian life, declining all offers for military reinstatement, consulting contracts, and speaking engagements. She refused to capitalize on her newfound fame or use the incident to build a public career in aviation or emergency management. Her only public statement came through a handwritten note released by her attorney. Heroes don't need medals or recognition. They just need people to keep breathing. The white business dress she had worn during the emergency was carefully cleaned and preserved, hanging in her closet as a reminder of the day when her hidden expertise had saved 247 lives. She never spoke publicly about her military background or the classified missions that had earned her the legendary Viper call sign. For the passengers who survived the emergency landing, Elena's image remained permanently etched in their memories. A professional woman in business attire, calmly commanding military aircraft and coordinating with NORAD, while everyone else panicked around her. The little girl who had dropped her stuffed airplane grew up to become a drone pilot for the Air Force. She kept a photo of Elena in her flight case, telling her colleagues, "I learned to fly because I once saw a woman in a white dress make F-22s listen to her voice." Military communication specialists began studying transcripts of Elena's radio coordination during the emergency, using her tactical decisions as training examples for managing complex airspace coordination under crisis conditions. Her methods became standard curriculum in advanced air traffic control courses. At civilian flight training centers, Elena's story became required reading for students learning emergency procedures and crisis management. The lesson wasn't about aviation technical skills, it was about recognizing expertise regardless of how it was packaged or presented. The leather notebook she had carried, with its pages of wind calculations and navigation notes, inspired a new generation of aviation professionals to maintain personal readiness for unexpected emergencies. "Stay ready" became an unofficial motto among pilots who understood that expertise must be maintained even when it's not being used professionally. Years later, when radio communications went silent during aviation emergencies, when aircraft disappeared from radar screens, when impossible coordination was needed to prevent disasters, air traffic controllers would sometimes hear faint transmissions that sounded like Elena's calm, professional voice guiding aircraft to safety. Flight instructors teaching emergency procedures would conclude their lessons by saying, "Remember the woman in white." When everything is falling apart and everyone is panicking, someone needs to stay calm and do what needs to be done. Someday, that someone might be you. Elena's legacy lived not in fame or official recognition, but in changed attitudes about assumptions and stereotypes. Corporate managers started paying closer attention to quiet employees they had previously overlooked. Airlines began asking different questions about passenger experience during emergencies. The most important lesson from Flight 447 wasn't about aviation or military coordination. It was about the danger of judging people based on their appearance, profession, or gender instead of taking time to discover their actual knowledge and capabilities. Elena Cross, call sign Viper, had proven that true expertise doesn't require uniforms, titles, or official recognition. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 17A, wearing a white business dress and waiting for the moment when knowledge and skill matter more than appearances and assumptions. In a world that judges people by their clothes, their profession, and their gender, Elena's story served as a powerful reminder that the person who saves your life might be someone you dismissed without ever really seeing who they were. Expertise doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It waits quietly until the moment arrives when lives depend on knowledge, competence, and the courage to act when conventional authority fails. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.